Putin, during his call with Trump, reportedly suggested the meeting place for himself and Zelensky as Moscow, which basically makes it impossible for the Ukrainian leader to attend because it would be seen as a humiliation for him to go to Moscow. And bear in mind, given what has happened to Russia, Putin's political opponents in Russia, he would probably risk assassination as well. So Putin also set the terms for what the next meeting would be.
We're back now to the White House. We're joined by George Grylls, the Times Washington correspondent, live on the line. Hello to you, George.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So look, we've heard from Caroline Leavitt defending the position of the President of the United States in the robust way that she does. This was Caroline Leavitt speaking just a short while ago to the media at the White House.
Until President Trump returned to office in January, the bloody and broken Biden status quo was to endlessly force American taxpayers to fund Ukraine no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, and no matter how many lives were lost. There is no denying that Biden's America Last foreign policy moved the world further away from peace. President Trump rejected that failed approach and instead, over the last 7 months, has relentlessly pursued peace throughout his second term. And thanks to President Trump's efforts, we finally have movement after years of deadly gridlock.
That's Caroline Leavitt speaking just a very short while ago. George Grylls watching it all from Washington, D.C. What are your thoughts, Joe? George, there's Caroline Leavitt doing what she does, presenting what was done over these last recent days in terms of triumph. How is this being presented there in the American capital?
Well, Trump has felt very stunned, basically, since the summit with Putin in Alaska, because he's not received particularly good reviews back home in the US, and he's been reading the papers and basically getting himself wound up at how he hasn't been celebrated for this summit that he kind of thought he ought to be. And, just in the run-up to the Zelensky meeting, he fired off a number of Truth Socials kind of complaining that he had been unfairly treated. And we kind of saw that today again at the beginning of the Caroline Leavitt briefing, where they went on about how, his approach to handling Putin has been extremely successful, and, he's doing a great job, all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting the construction on what happened yesterday that one might expect, and no doubt from her side a great deal of sincerity. Your own judgment on this, George. I've been spending my time on air today looking at the question of how useful, how constructive was the exercise at the White House after what happened in Alaska on Friday, and struggling to see evidence that what happened was something to be celebrated by anyone, much really beyond the Kremlin, beyond Putin and his gang in Moscow. And it's not an isolated perception. There are many pretty thoughtful people who take the same sort of view on the facts, George.
So if we go back to Alaska, if you think about what he said then, he said the meeting with Putin would be a precursor to a trilateral summit between himself, Putin, and Zelensky. Then following this meeting yesterday, he kind of dropped that sequencing and said instead, no, actually Zelensky and Putin need to have their face-to-face meeting first, and then I'll attend, in the words of Caroline Leavitt, if necessary afterwards. Now, bear in mind that Putin, during his call with Trump, reportedly suggested the meeting place for himself and Zelensky as Moscow, which basically makes it impossible for the Ukrainian leader to attend because it would be seen as a humiliation for him to go to Moscow. And bear in mind, given what has happened to Russia, Putin's political opponents in Russia, he would probably risk assassination as well. So Putin also set the terms for what the next meeting would be. If you remember his closing words in that press conference with Trump in Alaska, he suddenly switched to English. Bear in mind, he rarely uses English in public, but he switched to English at this important moment. And he made this apparently off-the-cuff joke. In fact, it was quite clearly scripted by the Kremlin to say next time it will be in Moscow. And that was setting the terms for what the next sort of meeting would be. Yeah. So, you would have to say over the past week or so, we've moved to a position where you have to feel the US is kind of backing out of wanting much of a role in kind of brokering an agreement. And you've even seen Trump himself say, the figure increases daily. He used to say he'd solved 5 wars, now we're up to 7. But he says that this one in Ukraine was supposed to be the easiest, and it's proving to be a bit tricky. And you can kind of feel a waning interest in kind of trying to resolve it.
That's a really interesting thought. Get Tim's thoughts and Scarlett's and yours as you listen to all of this discussion and debate here on Pino and Friends on Times Radio.
Get the day's politics, business
And with us on Pino and Friends, Tim Montgomery, Scarlett Maguire, and George Grylls is live on the line, the Times Washington correspondent. So, George, I want to bring Scarlett and Tim into this, and it's great to have you here with us this evening. We're hearing more and more about the idea of a meeting, between Zelensky and Putin, maybe trilateral, three-sided with Putin, with Trump getting involved. The big problem with all of that, as we sit here, is that the war goes on, and Donald Trump has dropped his objections, or rather said he's no longer seeking a ceasefire as a precondition to talks. Now, when yesterday we heard from President Trump in the White House, he kind of ducked questions about all of that. Has there been any kind of elaboration of that position from the White House today?
Well, I think what has mainly happened is, if you recall a few weeks ago, Trump's strategy was carrot and stick. So he said, to Putin, if you don't stop the war by August the 8th, then I will impose huge secondary sanctions on those countries that buy Russian oil. Then basically Putin said, forget about the August the 8th deadline. We'll have a bilateral meeting. We'll sort it all out there. So the threat of sanctions were pushed back a bit further. In fact, he put some kind of 50% tariffs on India, but by and large, the kind of majority of the sanctions that have been promised didn't come through. Since that point, we haven't seen Russia agree to a ceasefire at all, and the sanctions haven't been leveraged. And basically, the stick has been removed from the equation, you would have to say. And now Trump is basically saying to Putin, I'd quite like you to attend this bilateral summit with Zelensky, but there's no stick to get him there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's simply a statement of fact. I mean, the threat of sanctions seems to have evaporated. The demand for a ceasefire